Hey, this is Michael Lindsay from Vital MX. We're here at Chaparral Motorsports today. We got the crew from Galfer, and we're going over the removal and install of brake lines and how to properly bleed them to get the best performance out of your brakes.
I'm Chris with Galfer Braking Systems, and this is Benny. And today we're going to be doing an install on a front brake line on this RMZ 250. Some helpful tools to have. You're going to need a torque wrench, a set of sockets, some screwdrivers, some flare nut wrenches, and a brake bleeder if you have access to one. So the first step in getting your bike ready for installing the brake line, you want to make sure you go ahead and level out the master cylinder. This is going to help prevent fluid from getting all over the bike, and it's going to make the bleeding process a little bit easier for you. From there, you want to go ahead and remove the brake fluid from the stock system. You can remove the cap here on the master cylinder, move down to the caliper, the bleeder port, and pull all the fluid out of the system. So we're going to go ahead and loosen the bleeder on the caliper, and we're going to go ahead and suck the fluid out of the system. If you don't have access to a vacuum bleeder, you can do the same thing with a small piece of hose. You can actually use the lever at the master cylinder to pump the fluid through the system. If you don't remove the fluid from the system, what you're going to have is a bunch of fluid all over your shop floor. So this is going to help save you from having a huge mess. So now that all the fluid's out of your system, you can move up to the master cylinder and remove the factory banjo bolt. You're going to need a hex wrench to do so. And as you're pulling that off, what's also going to be helpful once you get the line off is to put something like a small piece of paper towel through the actual banjo eyelet here. And that's just going to prevent you from getting brake fluid on anything else on the bike. Just like that works fine. So next you're going to be moving to the caliper. We're going to go ahead and remove the factory banjo bolt here as well. Again, using the same hex wrench. Have some paper towels ready, as when you remove this, you're going to have a little bit of fluid coming out. And as with the top line, you want to also put a piece of paper towel through the banjo eyelet at the bottom, just to prevent fluid from coming out. So next step is going to be to remove the factory clamp here on the fork guard. You got two small hexes, it's an 8mm. And from there, we're now going to move up a little bit here on the bike and have a second clamp up at the lower triple clamp. So going to install the Galfer brake line, we're going to start at the master cylinder. All of our Galfer brake lines are going to include a label that shows which end is intended for the master cylinder. And it's going to install in the stock orientation. So we have this banjo, it's going to move away from the actual master cylinder. All of our Galfer brake lines are going to include banjo bolts and the necessary crush washers for installation. We are going to include 2 for each connection point, as well as 2 extras, so don't be alarmed if there's 2 extras in your kit. The banjo is going to be installed with 1 washer against the nut and 1 against the master cylinder. You're going to thread it in just like the factory line. At this point, you do want to thread this in and get a snug fit, but you don't need to torque this. So next, we're going to start fastening the OEM clamps. The first one at the lower triple clamp here. Just going to use the factory clamp with the factory hardware, reinstall that. Then we're going to move down to the fork guard. This will install with the factory fork guard clamp. Make sure that you have our stiffener positioned at the change in diameter in the clamp here. This is going to look just like the factory setup. So next we're going to move to the caliper. We're going to install the caliper banjo in the same factory orientation. It's going to actually bend away from the caliper with the same configuration on bolts and washers we did up top. Just want to gently thread that in. There's a little bit of tension on the line, so you want to make sure you don't cross thread that. It's very important that when you are actually attaching the banjo bolt to the caliper, you snug that bolt down. Moving up to the master cylinder, we're going to go ahead and put some fluid in the master cylinder. This is really helpful if you have 2 people at this point. As you start to get in the bleeding process, it can be done by 1, but 2 makes everything a lot easier. Now this is a step that may or may not be necessary. I find it pretty helpful. At this point, I'll actually crack the banjo bolt slightly loose, just about a 1/4 turn here at the master, and I'll push some fluid out of this orifice. You do that by pushing down on the lever, just in the same fashion that you would bleed a brake. It's a down-up procedure. Hold that lever down, snug that bolt. Doesn't have to be, again, tight or torqued, just snug enough. Release that lever, let it up, and then you're going to go through that process again. And this is where it helps to have somebody. He's going to push down. I'm going to tighten it, go ahead and up. You only have to do this maybe 2-3 times. Down. and up. That should be good. You just want to make sure that you get some fluid out of the master cylinder, and this will help eliminate air bubbles in the system as you move down further in the system. One important step from now through the rest of the bleeding process, you need to keep an eye on the master cylinder fluid level. You never want that to run dry. It's not the end of the world if it does, but you are going to have to start bleeding process again from scratch if you do run that thing dry. So Benny's going to make sure that we keep that fluid reservoir full. I'm going to go ahead and crack the bleeder down here. Now, if you have the vacuum system available, this is very helpful at this point to remove any of the air. If you don't, you could be done with a standard gravity bleed process or a down-up procedure like we did a little bit earlier. So I'm going to crack this loose. And we want to get a flow of fluid. It won't necessarily be clean and clear, but you want to see some fluid coming out of the caliper. So we're going to continue doing this until we see that. So at this point, we're seeing some fluid starting to come out of the caliper. I want to let that run for a few seconds here. We're going to do a standard bleeding process regardless of what bleeding method you're using at the end to ensure that we have a good steady flow of fluid. So we're going to do a standard bleed on the system after the vacuum bleeding. The reason being that it's hard to tell if you're getting air and or fluid out of the actual bleed hose. The vacuum bleeder sometimes can actually pull air through the system as well. So that's the reason that we kind of finish up with this step. So now we're going to move up to the master cylinder. Benny's going to help us. We're going to give the lever a couple pumps. They don't have to be fast, they can be slow. And then you should start to feel a little bit of pressure at the master cylinder here. If you don't have any kind of pressure whatsoever, you might want to go back down to the caliper and bleed it a little bit further. But from here, he's going to hold the lever down in the same process we used on the banjo bolt. I'm going to open the bleeder on the caliper, and we're going to release some of that fluid and air. I'm going to let Benny know when I have that bleeder tighten back up. I'm going to say, okay, you can go ahead and release. He'll release the lever, and he'll go ahead and give it a couple more pumps. We're going to repeat this process 2, 3, maybe 4 times. You should feel a slow improvement in the brake lever, and the level of the lever should come up a little bit. So go ahead and hold that down. Up, and a couple pumps. Down. Up. And give it a couple pumps. Hold it down. Up. So now that you have a good bleed on the system, I have a nice firm lever here. We're going to go through, we want to tidy everything up. We're going to go through the banjo bolts. I want to make sure these are torqued to spec. Our spec for anything that's silver or gold fittings is going to be between 15 and 17 foot-pounds. Anything that's anodized aluminum, red, black, or blue, is going to be 12 to 15 foot-pounds. Want to use an appropriate torque wrench on those. Once you get that finished, you're going to put the master cylinder reservoir cap back on. Usually want the fluid topped off to about 3/4 of the way full. That's sufficient. And have some rags underneath in case you can spill a little bit of fluid so it doesn't get on the bike. We do include 2 extra crush washers with all of our Galfer brake line kits. In the event that you have to remove one of those connection points during the installation process, keep in mind those are single use only, so you don't want to reuse them. If you have any questions doing the install, feel free to give our tech department a call at any time, and we appreciate you considering Galfer products for your motorcycle. Thank you.